They said wars would always be fought for gold, for oil, for land. But no one told us the next war in Africa would begin with a well. Picture this. The red earth of Burkina Faso, cracked and thirsty. Children walk for miles with empty jugs while in the shadows of dawn, colossal tankers steal away 10 million liters of clean water every single day. Not for the farmers, not for the people, for a foreign mine hidden behind mercenaries and silence. If water is life, who gave them the right to sell our life? Who signs away the rivers that feed our children? And why does the world stay quiet when a whole nation is forced to thirst? For the people of Burkina Faso, this was not a policy dispute. It was colonization in liquid form. And one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, stood in the middle of that desert and said enough. Brothers and sisters, our ancestors fought for the right to drink from public fountains, to walk with dignity into places once barred. Today, another generation fights to drink from their own soil. If you believe water must never be for sale, write, "Water is life" in the comments. Because this story has only just begun. It began not with soldiers on horseback or tanks at the border, but with a contract signed in silence. Oryx Global Holdings, a company few had ever heard of, walked into West Africa with $600 million and walked out with something far more precious: water. Not land, not gold, not oil. Water. The deal was dressed up in polite language, cross-border extraction rights, hydrological assurance, strategic access. But hidden beneath the words was a betrayal. Over 4 million cubic meters of water every month, enough to irrigate 5,000 hectares of farmland, enough to sustain 2 million people through the dry season, was rerouted to rinse ore in a neighboring mine. And while Burkina Faso's farmers bent over dry soil, 15 tankers rolled at dawn across the desert roads. Colossal shadows carrying away 10 million liters a day, guarded not by local law, but by men in black uniforms, helmets gleaming under the Sahel sun. 800 mercenaries flown in under civilian codes, stationed not to protect life, but to defend a pipeline. Where were the headlines? Where was the outrage? There were none, because the contract was legal. Signed behind closed doors in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, stamped with diplomatic seals. Legal theft dressed as development. But the ground knew the truth. Satellite readings showed a 32% drop in moisture levels across northern farmlands. Wells that once filled in a week stood bone dry for a month. Families dug deeper only to find sand. Crops shriveled without a sound. And still the tankers rolled. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat with the document in his hand, lips tight, eyes fixed. 4 million, he whispered, repeating the number like a curse. 4 million every month. He looked at his ministers. Do you know what this means? That is bread on the tables of millions. That is cattle that will live or die. That is the soul of our soil. The room fell silent. Everyone knew. This was not an ordinary contract. It was colonization in liquid form. And the betrayal was not only foreign. How many signatures had it taken? How many officials had been paid to stay quiet while water bled out beneath their feet? In the villages, people noticed. Soldiers who spoke no local dialect stood at pumps with rifles. Mothers carrying jugs were turned away. Drones captured trenches dug around reservoirs not for pipes, but for defense lines. You build trenches only when you expect war. By the time the evidence reached Traoré's desk, the outrage was no longer political. It was survival. Farmers asked how they would plant. Mothers asked how they would cook. Elders asked how long before even the wells in Ouagadougou ran dry. He closed the folder slowly. This is not infrastructure, he said. This is invasion. That night, a single decree began to take shape. Burkina Faso would not beg, would not bargain. It would reclaim. But how do you fight a war when the enemy wears a suit, not a uniform? When the bullets are contracts and the battlefield is your own veins of water? The captain's answer would not be written in ink. It would be carved in concrete steel and sovereign will. The desert does not forgive silence. By the time the world learned of the hidden pumps, it was too late for quiet debates. The lines had already been drawn. On one side, Burkina Faso, 1,200 troops, engineers, and hundreds of villagers, carrying nothing but plastic jugs and photographs of their dry wells. On the other, 800 foreign mercenaries, hired hands with no flag, their weapons trained on the very water that should have been free. It was the 72nd hour of standoff when Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward. He wore no medals, no polished uniform, just a sand-colored vest and a plain white shirt already soaked with sweat. The sun was merciless, but his steps were steady measured. Cameras zoomed in. The people watched, and the mercenaries for the first time hesitated. Behind him, villagers formed a wall, not of stone, not of steel, a living wall of the thirsty. Men with cracked hands from parched soil, women clutching empty cans, children with dust on their faces but fire in their eyes. They stood shoulder to shoulder with soldiers, their silence louder than any slogan. One foreign contractor whispered nervously, "What are they doing?" Another answered, "They're building a wall." With what? People. Traore raised his hand, not a fist, not a weapon, just a hand. And the desert fell still. His voice, quiet but sharp, cut across the dust. This is not a negotiation. This is not war. This is the moment your silence ends. He turned to 5 engineers kneeling at the pumping station service hatch. Their tools were not rifles, but hydraulic keys and digital locks. The mercenaries shifted uneasily. Cameras from 3 continents rolled. How do you justify opening fire over water? Sir, system unlocked, one engineer called. Manual override ready. Traore gave a single nod. The command was not shouted, not barked, but carried with a weight heavier than steel. The engineers pressed the sequence. At 14:36, the valve cracked open. First a hum, low and trembling. Then a surge, a roar of cold, clear water rushing back toward Burkina Faso. It carved through the sand like a living river glistening under the sun. Children screamed with joy. Elders fell to their knees weeping. Soldiers, hardened by war, let their rifles hang as they touched the streams with bare hands. And the cameras captured everything. A president opening water with engineers, not tanks. A nation reclaiming life without a bullet fired. That night, social media across Africa erupted. Hashtags flared at Hashwater's life. French media called it escalation. Western outlets called it a provocation. But on the streets of Ouagadougou and Bamako and Niamey, the people called it something else, sovereignty in motion. In Toronto, Oryx Global's stock plunged 15% in 3 days. Boardrooms scrambled. Shareholders demanded answers. But no PR statement could erase the image of villagers standing as a human wall while water flowed home. For 3 days, the desert held its breath. No shots were fired, no tanks rolled. Just one man and his nation daring the world to cross a line not drawn in ink, but in water. And yet the question remained, what comes after water returns? Would the world accept this defiance, or would they punish it? When the first streams of water rushed back into Burkina Faso, it was more than liquid flowing through a pipe. It was dignity returning to a people who had been told their thirst was normal, their suffering inevitable. For months, fields had cracked. Villages had withered, and children had walked miles under the sun for a single jug. Now, for the first time in years, irrigation canals filled again, and the desert began to whisper of life. The impact was immediate. Within weeks, maize fields sprouted green shoots where only dust had lain. Sorghum stalks rose tall, swaying like a congregation in prayer. Agricultural yields surged by 20% in a single planting cycle. Clinics reported a 42% drop in waterborne illnesses, mothers no longer forced to give their children murky river water. For the first time in 6 years, the National Grain Reserve exceeded emergency levels, a sign that the nation might feed itself again. But Traore knew infrastructure without justice was fragile. He stood before his finance minister and declared, "No farmer will pay to drink his own soil. No mother will be taxed to water her child." A decree was signed, 2 years of tax relief for agricultural loans and free reconnection to sovereign water systems. The Treasury protested, warning of deficits. Traore's reply was blunt. What deficit is greater than a nation that forgets how to feed itself? This was not only about survival. It was about rewriting the nation's economy from the ground up. Thousands of jobs were created as young engineers. Masons and well diggers joined the reconstruction effort. Materials were sourced locally compressed earth bricks, solar-powered pumps and pipes forged in Burkina's own workshops. For decades, foreign companies had taken profits out of the soil. Now, the soil was finally paying back its own children. Beyond economics, there was something spiritual in the return of water. At Tenodogo, villagers gathered as the first reservoir broke ground. A grandmother dipped her hand into the new basin, then lifted the water to her forehead. "This is not just water," she said softly. "This is God remembering us." Her words spread like a prayer across radios and phones. International partners noticed. The Dutch-led Blue Deal initiative, already supporting water management in Burkina Faso, began consultations on how to expand transparent monitoring of wells and reservoirs. Satellite tracking systems were linked with QR codes painted on every tanker, allowing ordinary citizens to scan and know where their water was flowing. "Secrets dry nations," Traore had said. Transparency would keep them alive. And yet, beneath the celebrations, shadows remained. Oryx Global had retreated, but whispers spoke of new contracts being drafted elsewhere in the Sahel. Climate change tightened its grip, threatening to make each rainy season shorter, each dry season longer. The return of water was not the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of a new kind of vigilance. Still in marketplaces from Kaya to Ouagadougou, a phrase began to circulate: "We drink our own water." It was said with pride, with relief, with defiance. For the farmers who had once considered abandoning their land for the children who no longer walked half a day for a jug, it was proof that a nation could stand against the current and redirect it back to its people. But even as the fields bloomed again, a question loomed: if one nation could reclaim its rivers, could the rest of Africa do the same? The world was watching, but not all with the same eyes. In Paris, headlines framed the event as dangerous escalation. In Washington, a spokesperson spoke of concerns for regional stability. On the BBC, analysts debated whether Traore had overstepped the bounds of international law. Yet, none of those voices had stood in line for hours to scoop a bucket of muddy water. None had seen a child faint from thirst. From the outside, it was politics. From the inside, it was survival. Western media painted Oryx Global as a victim of resource nationalism. But in Bamako, Niamey, and Conakry, the story was different. "Sovereignty in motion," one Malayan commentator declared. "We are watching a nation remind the world that our rivers are not for sale." Across African social media, the images of villagers forming a human wall went viral. The hashtags were not just digital noise, they were a chorus hash. "Water is life" hash, Africa Forward, Traore speaks. And then came the ripple effect. Within 3 weeks, 5 nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, and Guinea, met under the dome of N'Djamena. The cameras clicked as leaders placed their hands on a single parchment: the Sahel Water Accord. Its opening line was simple, but revolutionary: water is not a commodity. It is the shared right of those who live by it. The accord pledged mutual defense of strategic water sources, transparent monitoring of cross-border flows, and the creation of a Sahel Sovereign Water Fund worth $2.4 billion. For the first time, a coalition of nations was declaring that water would be guarded as fiercely as borders, treated not as a product, but as a birthright. Not everyone cheered. Oryx Global's shares plummeted 15% in Toronto. Board members resigned. Investors demanded to know why a company with a $600 million contract had been forced out by a single act of defiance. In Brussels, whispers began about sanctions. In Washington, think tanks warned of hydro-nationalism destabilizing development aid frameworks. But in Ouagadougou, no one cared about those words. They were too busy planting. Meanwhile, the African Union convened an emergency summit in Addis Ababa. For the first time, serious voices asked, should Africa build an OPEC for water? Not to drive up prices, but to protect rivers, aquifers, and rainfall cycles from being sold off piecemeal. When a BBC journalist posed that question directly to Traore, he paused, then smiled faintly. Why not? We have bled for oil, for gold, for diamonds. But only water keeps us alive. Shouldn't we be the ones to decide how life flows? That answer reverberated across the diaspora. In Atlanta, in Kingston, and Accra, elders nodded at their screens. They remembered when their parents were told to drink from separate fountains, when dignity itself was rationed. Now, they watched a young African president defend the right to drink from his own soil. It felt less like politics and more like prophecy. But sovereignty is never free. Reports surfaced of private military contractors reinforcing other water sites across the Sahel. Satellite images revealed new fortifications around aquifers in Niger and Chad. The message was clear. The battle for water was only beginning. Still, something irreversible had shifted. Traore had turned a hidden contract into a continental question. Was Africa ready to guard its rivers as fiercely as the Middle East guarded its oil? Was the time coming when water, not diamonds or gold, would define the continent's power? For now, the Sahel stood united, at least on paper. But the true test would come when the next pipeline was laid, the next tanker rolled, the next contract was signed. And in that silence between signatures, the world would once again look to Burkina Faso, because the question had already been asked. And once asked, it cannot be buried. Who decides how Africa's water flows? The standoff ended without gunfire, but the echoes of that moment reached far beyond the Sahel. Water had flowed again, yet new questions flooded the continent. What comes after a nation dares to claim its rivers? What happens when sovereignty is measured not in borders, but in every leader reclaimed? In the short term, Burkina Faso faces the weight of retaliation. Corporations displaced from one contract will seek another. Diplomatic cables hint at economic pressure, delayed loans, even the specter of sanctions. Western media has already framed Traoré's act as hydro-nationalism, a label designed to isolate him. But within his own nation, the people do not speak of nationalism, they speak of survival. And a people who have tasted water again cannot easily be turned back to thirst. In the medium term, the idea may spread like fire across dry grass. Niger, already straining under the shadow of foreign uranium contracts, is reportedly studying Burkina Faso's model. Mali, wrestling with desertification and foreign mining concessions, has sent delegations to learn from the engineering methods of the new reservoirs. Even in Ethiopia, where disputes over the Nile have reached international courts, scholars are whispering about a future in which African nations form a bloc, not just around rivers, but around the principle that water belongs first to its people. The long term holds a more radical possibility: the birth of a water OPEC. Not an organization to hoard or inflate prices, but a covenant to protect. Imagine a council of African nations standing together to say, our rivers are not for sale. Our aquifers are not bargaining chips. Water flows first to those who live upon the soil, and only then to markets. Such an alliance would change the balance of global power more deeply than oil ever did. For without oil, economies slow. Without water, civilizations end. But unity is not guaranteed. Africa's greatest strength, its vast rivers, lakes, and aquifers, is also its greatest vulnerability. From the Nile to Lake Chad, from the Congo Basin to the Sahel water crosses, borders more easily than any flag. One nation's dam can be another's drought. The choice before Africa is stark: fight each other for rivers or stand together to guard them. Traore himself seemed to know this. In a closed-door meeting with civil engineers, he asked quietly, what if the next blockade is not in Burkina Faso, but in Mali or Niger? Will they stand alone? Or will we stand as one river? His words were less about policy than prophecy. For history has shown, when Africa waits, others write the contracts. But when Africa rises, others must rewrite the rules. And so the horizon splits in two. In one path, retaliation sanctions mercenaries' backroom deals. In the other, transformation treaties, new reservoirs, a continent that finally guards the source of its own life. The choice is not only for Traore. It is for every leader who looks at a river and must decide sell it, or he safeguards it. For the people of Burkina Faso, the choice has already been made. They have seen water flow again, not as charity, not as aid, but as birthright. And once a people taste that freedom, no contract, no corporation, no foreign flag can easily make them forget. So the question lingers over Africa like a gathering storm. When the next well runs dry, will the continent stand divided by borders or united by rivers? The desert remembers. It remembers the silence when wells dried and the world looked away. It remembers the day when children carried empty cans like crosses, walking miles for a single drop. But it will also remember this: the moment a nation said no more, and water came home, not through aid, not through mercy, but through courage. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not bring water with guns. He brought it with conviction. He stood where the thirsty stood and declared that life itself is not for sale. His words were simple, but they cut through centuries of contracts and chains. Those who hold the water hold the life. And here, life is not for sale. Brothers and sisters, this is not just Burkina Faso's story. It is Africa's mirror. For too long, rivers have been redirected, aquifers sold, rain turned into profit. But when one nation dares to reclaim its birthright, the question echoes across the continent: what if we all did the same? What if every river, every lake, every drop was guarded as fiercely as our ancestors guarded freedom? For those of you watching in Atlanta, in Detroit, in Lagos, in Accra, you know this struggle. Our elders once fought for the right to drink from public fountains without shame. Today, another generation fights to drink from their own soil without permission. History is not repeating, it is calling. And now the choice is not only for leaders in Africa, it is for all of us who believe in dignity. When water is stolen, do we stay silent? When a nation stands up, do we stand with them? If you believe that Africa must guard its rivers as fiercely as oil once guarded empires, write New Africa in the comments. If you believe water is life type, water is life. If you believe sovereignty is not a slogan but survival, then let your voice be counted. Because this story does not end with the valve turning in the desert. It ends with us. With our willingness to say that freedom cannot be borrowed, dignity cannot be outsourced, and water, the source of life itself, must never be for sale. So I leave you with this question: when the next river is threatened, when the next well runs dry, will Africa wait for permission? Or will it rise like a flood, unstoppable? The desert remembers, the rivers remember, and now it is our turn.